Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine with the stated objective of demilitarizing the country and stripping it of any meaningful ability to resist Russian political and military control. This goal was central to Vladimir Putin's broader vision of restoring Russian influence over former Soviet territories and preventing Ukraine from fully integrating with Western political and security structures, such as the European Union and NATO. The assumption behind this objective was that Ukraine was fundamentally weak, divided, and militarily incapable of sustaining a prolonged defense against a large-scale Russian assault. This belief was not formed in a vacuum. Rather, it was heavily shaped by Ukraine's military condition in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea with minimal resistance and supported separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. At that time, Ukraine's armed forces were severely underfunded, poorly trained, and equipped largely with outdated Soviet-era weapons that were often in disrepair. Corruption within state institutions further undermined military effectiveness, and years of political instability had left the country without a coherent long-term defense strategy. From Moscow's perspective, Ukraine appeared to be a fragile state whose military shortcomings could be easily exploited. Putin's confidence was reinforced by the apparent success of the Crimea operation, which unfolded rapidly and with little direct confrontation. Russian forces encountered almost no organized resistance, and the Ukrainian government, caught off guard and constrained by international considerations, was unable to respond decisively. This experience shaped a dangerous narrative within the Russian leadership, that Ukraine lacked both the will and capacity to fight. As a result, Russian strategic planning for the later full-scale invasion was based on the expectation of a swift collapse of Ukrainian defenses, a rapid seizure of key cities, and the installation of a compliant government in Kyiv. Russian military doctrine emphasized speed, shock, and overwhelming force, assuming that Ukrainian resistance would crumble once faced with superior firepower and coordinated assaults. In this sense, the invasion was not designed for a long war, but for a short, decisive campaign that would confirm Russia's dominance in the region. However, this assumption proved to be a profound strategic miscalculation. What Russian planners failed to adequately consider was how deeply the events of 2014 had transformed Ukraine's political consciousness and military outlook. Rather than accepting defeat, Ukraine had spent the years following Crimea reassessing its vulnerabilities and gradually rebuilding its defense capabilities. Although progress was uneven and constrained by economic limitations, Ukraine began reforming its armed forces, improving command structures, and seeking closer cooperation with NATO members. Training programs, joint exercises, and advisory missions helped Ukrainian forces adopt more flexible and adaptive operational doctrines, particularly emphasizing decentralized command and small unit initiative. These changes were not immediately visible to outside observers, especially those relying on outdated intelligence or biased assumptions, but they fundamentally altered Ukraine's capacity to respond to aggression. Equally important was the transformation of Ukrainian society itself. Russian leadership underestimated the degree to which national identity and public resolve had hardened in response to earlier aggression. The annexation of Crimea and the conflict in the Donbass region had convinced many Ukrainians that Russian ambitions extended beyond limited territorial adjustments and posed an existential threat to Ukrainian sovereignty. This realization fostered a strong sense of national unity and a willingness among civilians to support the military effort, whether through enlistment, volunteer networks, or logistical assistance. When the full-scale invasion began, Ukraine was not a passive or indifferent society. It was a mobilized nation prepared, psychologically and politically, to resist. Another critical flaw in Russia's original objective was a failure to appreciate Ukraine's ability to adapt rapidly under pressure. Modern warfare is not solely determined by initial force ratios, but by learning, innovation, and resilience over time. Ukraine demonstrated an exceptional capacity to absorb early losses, analyze Russian tactics, and adjust its own strategies accordingly. Flexible defensive operations, effective use of intelligence, and rapid integration of new technologies allowed Ukrainian forces to blunt Russian advances and, in some cases, push them back. This adaptability stood in stark contrast to Russia's more rigid command structure, which struggled to respond to unexpected resistance and logistical challenges. In hindsight, the goal of demilitarizing Ukraine was not only unrealistic, but fundamentally contradictory. Rather than eliminating Ukraine's military potential, The invasion acted as a catalyst for its expansion and modernization. The longer the conflict continued, the more Ukraine mobilized its population, economy, and international partnerships to strengthen its armed forces. Russia's initial assumption that Ukraine would collapse as it had in Crimea ignored the lessons Ukraine itself had learned from that very experience. Crimea was not a template for future success. It was a warning sign that galvanized Ukrainian reform and resistance. By failing to recognize this shift, Russia embarked on a war based on outdated perceptions and flawed strategic logic, setting the stage for an extended conflict that would undermine its own military objectives and expose the limits of coercive power in the face of national resilience. Instead of collapsing under the weight of Russia's invasion, Ukraine transformed the conflict into a powerful catalyst for military renewal, modernization, and strategic innovation. What Russia expected to be a short and decisive campaign instead triggered a long-term process through which Ukraine rebuilt its armed forces into one of the most capable and experienced militaries in Europe. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor was it the result of a single factor. Rather, it emerged in a combination of sustained cooperation with NATO, hard-earned battlefield experience, and an extraordinary capacity for rapid technological and organizational adaptation under extreme pressure. The invasion forced Ukraine to confront the reality that its survival depended on building a military capable not only of defending its territory, but also countering a much larger and better-equipped adversary through smarter, more flexible means. Long-term cooperation with NATO played a foundational role in this transformation. Even before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine had been working with NATO partners to reform its military institutions, improve training standards, and modernize command structures. After 2022, this cooperation intensified dramatically. Ukrainian forces adopted NATO-style doctrines that emphasized decentralized decision-making, interoperability, and mission-based command, allowing frontline units to react quickly to changing battlefield conditions. Training programs provided by NATO countries help Ukrainian soldiers master modern tactics, logistics, and coordination across land, air, and intelligence domains. Unlike traditional top-down command models, this approach empowered junior officers and non-commissioned officers to take initiative, which proved critical in resisting Russian advances and exploiting operational opportunities. Over time, this doctrinal shift turned Ukraine's armed forces into a more agile and resilient fighting force capable of sustaining prolonged operations. Battlefield experience further accelerated Ukraine's military evolution. Continuous engagement against a technologically advanced adversary forced Ukrainian units to learn, adapt, and innovate in real time. Each phase of the war served as a testing ground for new tactics and technologies, with successful methods quickly scaled up and ineffective ones discarded. This constant learning cycle gave Ukraine an advantage that could not be replicated through training alone. Soldiers, commanders, and planners developed an intuitive understanding of modern high-intensity warfare, including the integration of intelligence, surveillance, precision strikes, and electronic warfare. As a result, Ukraine's military became not only larger but also uniquely experienced, possessing a level of combat knowledge unmatched by most European armies that had not faced such sustained conflict in decades. One of the most remarkable aspects of Ukraine's transformation was the rapid expansion of its domestic defense industry. At the beginning of the invasion, Ukraine relied heavily on foreign military aid and inherited Soviet-era equipment. While international support remained essential, Ukraine quickly recognized that long-term survival required domestic production capacity that could respond faster than external supply chains. Under wartime conditions, the country dramatically scaled up its defense manufacturing, focusing on weapon systems that could be produced efficiently, upgraded quickly, and deployed at scale. This industrial mobilization was especially visible in the field of drone technology, which became a cornerstone of Ukraine's military strategy. Ukraine's drone industry evolved from small volunteer initiatives into a vast and sophisticated production network. By prioritizing drones that were relatively inexpensive yet highly effective, Ukraine achieved near self-sufficiency in one of the most decisive areas of modern warfare. These systems were used for reconnaissance, targeting, electronic warfare, air defense interception, and precision strikes deep behind enemy lines. Unlike traditional weapons platforms that require years to develop an enormous financial investment, drones allowed Ukraine to innovate rapidly, iterate designs based on battlefield feedback, and overwhelm Russian forces through sheer numbers and tactical creativity. This approach fundamentally altered the cost-benefit balance of the war, enabling Ukraine to inflict disproportionate damage using low-cost systems against high-value enemy assets. Beyond material production, Ukraine's military transformation also redefined how modern wars can be fought by smaller or less resource-rich states. Instead of relying on mass formations and heavy armor alone, Ukraine embraced a strategy centered on precision, information dominance, and asymmetric disruption. Drones, combined with real-time intelligence and decentralized command, allowed Ukrainian forces to strike critical targets, disrupt logistics, and undermine Russian operational coherence. This model demonstrated that effectiveness in modern warfare is not solely determined by the size of a military budget or the number of tanks, but by adaptability, innovation, and the intelligent use of technology. Crucially, this growth allowed Ukraine not only to defend itself, but also to shape the future of military thinking beyond its borders. NATO countries and other partners began studying Ukrainian methods, incorporating lessons learned from the conflict into their own doctrines and procurement strategies. In this sense, Ukraine transitioned from a security consumer to a security contributor, influencing how advanced militaries conceptualize drone warfare, combined arms operations, and resilience under sustained attack. The very war that was intended to strip Ukraine of its military power instead elevated it into a leading example of modern defense adaptation. In the end, Ukraine's response to invasion revealed a fundamental truth about contemporary conflict. Military strength is not static but dynamic, shaped by learning, innovation, and national resolve. By turning invasion into an opportunity for transformation, Ukraine built a force capable of defending its sovereignty while simultaneously redefining the principles of modern warfare. Rather than being weakened, Ukraine emerged more capable, more experienced, and more influential than ever before, an outcome that stands in direct opposition to Russia's original objectives. While Ukraine steadily strengthened its military capabilities, Russia moved in the opposite direction, suffering severe and compounding losses in manpower, equipment, and industrial capacity that undermined its ability to wage a prolonged modern war. What was initially presented as a limited, special military operation evolved into a grinding conflict that exposed deep structural weaknesses within Russia's armed forces and defense economy. Over time, these weaknesses became impossible to conceal as battlefield losses mounted and the strain on Russia's military-industrial complex intensified. Rather than overwhelming Ukraine through superior force, Russia found itself trapped in a war of attrition that steadily eroded its own military power. One of the most visible signs of Russia's decline has been the massive destruction of its military equipment. Thousands of tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, aircraft, and air defense systems were destroyed or disabled throughout the conflict. These losses were not limited to obsolete platforms, but included some of Russia's most advanced systems, which were expected to provide decisive advantages on the battlefield. The scale of these losses forced Russia to draw deeply from long-term storage facilities, reactivating tanks and vehicles that dated back to the Soviet era. Many of these systems were never designed for modern, high-intensity warfare and lacked adequate protection against precision-guided munitions and drones. Their reintroduction reflected not strategic choice, but necessity, highlighting Russia's inability to replace losses at a pace consistent with battlefield demands. As equipment shortages worsened, Russia also faced growing problems with ammunition and logistics. Despite its reputation as an artillery-heavy military power, Russia struggled to sustain the enormous volume of fire required for its operational doctrine. Domestic production proved insufficient to meet consumption rates, forcing Russia to seek foreign sources of ammunition, including supplies from states with limited industrial capacity and outdated stockpiles. This reliance on external support not only exposed vulnerabilities in Russia's supply chains, but also undermined its image as a self-sufficient military power. In many cases, the quality and reliability of imported munitions were questionable, further reducing battlefield effectiveness and increasing operational risks for Russian forces. Beyond material losses, Russia's manpower crisis has been even more damaging in the long term. Casualties mounted at a rate that far exceeded initial expectations, placing immense strain on both the armed forces and society at large. The loss of experienced soldiers and officers weakened unit cohesion, reduced combat effectiveness, and increased reliance on hastily trained or poorly motivated recruits. Efforts to replenish manpower through partial mobilization and recruitment incentives revealed deep social resistance and highlighted the limits of Russia's ability to generate sustained military participation. Over time, the human cost of the war began to affect not only frontline operations, but also the broader functioning of the state. The shrinking pool of skilled labor has had particularly severe consequences for Russia's defense industry. Modern weapon production requires highly trained engineers, technicians, and specialized workers, many of whom were either conscripted, killed, or chose to leave the country to avoid the war and its economic consequences. This loss of human capital severely constrained Russia's ability to expand or even maintain production levels. Factories struggled with labor shortages, aging infrastructure, and limited access to advanced technologies due to international sanctions. As a result, Russia's defense industry found itself unable to replace destroyed equipment at a rate sufficient to sustain offensive operations, creating a widening gap between battlefield losses and industrial output. The economic burden of the war further compounded these problems. Russia dramatically increased defense spending to sustain military operations, diverting resources away from civilian sectors and long-term economic development. While this allowed the war effort to continue in the short term, it created structural imbalances that weakened the overall economy. Sanctions imposed by Western countries restricted access to key technologies, financial markets, and export revenues, particularly in energy and arms sales, two pillars of Russia's economic strength. Declining export income reduced the state's ability to finance prolonged military operations without resorting to inflationary measures, tax increases, or cuts in social spending. Over time, these economic pressures fed back into military weakness. Reduced access to advanced components limited the quality of newly produced weapons, while financial constraints slowed modernization efforts. The need to prioritize immediate battlefield requirements came at the expense of research, development, and long-term force planning. This short-term focus left Russia increasingly reliant on outdated doctrines and equipment, even as Ukraine and its partners continued to innovate and adapt. The contrast between Russia's stagnation and Ukraine's evolution became one of the defining features of the conflict. Ultimately, Russia's experience illustrates how modern warfare punishes states that lack adaptability, transparency, and sustainable economic foundations. The combination of heavy equipment losses, massive casualties, industrial decline, and economic strain created a vicious cycle that steadily weakened Russia's military power. Each attempt to compensate for losses generated new problems, whether through rush production, reliance on inferior equipment, or unsustainable economic measures. Far from achieving its objective of demilitarizing Ukraine, Russia instead inflicted deep and lasting damage on its own armed forces and defense industry, calling into question its long-term capacity to project power and maintain its status as a major military force.